today, as you've said, our focus moves to post-conflict situations. The situation which arises once, in some way or another, the smoke from the barrels and the sound of the bombs and the crying of people comes to an end. That is not always easy to predict, and it's not always easy to estimate when that will happen. But the struggle to rebuild a community, a country, a nation, a society in the days after a conflict has ceased is one of the most gigantic tasks that I know. The struggle to bring an end to violence is immense. And what I want to say to you this morning is based on my personal experience of being a part of the process which brought an end to the violence in Ireland, which had lasted some 30 years. And in that time had cost so many lives, ruined so many lives, and destroyed so many lives. And the first issue I want to put to you, while it's not definitely linked to Syria, my ideas that I share with you this morning, I hope can be applied to the Syrian situation as to any situation of conflict. The first thing that we need to identify is, when does a peace process begin? One theory, obviously, is that the peace process follows the end of violence. In my experience, that is not always true. The seeds of a peace process are often set as the violence continues. And it's in that scenario that you get the first indications that A, there are enough people wanting to find a way forward, and B, they are the people who can deliver. Because in my experience, there are a lot of people who think they can deliver peace, but are not in a position to do so. It's the people who sometimes do not present themselves first and foremost who are the important ones. In the years in which the peace process began in my country, there were voices calling for the likes of me and others to begin the peace process who themselves were not a part of the violence. And the first thing I would say to you is that from my experience, it is vital you identify those who can deliver. And those who can deliver are not always those that sound as if they can deliver. A lot of time was wasted in my situation dealing with people who said they could bring peace, but in fact they were empty symbols. They were people who were more important to themselves than to other people. Once we had identified those who were in a position to deliver a reasonable sense of peace, there then began the vital task of encouraging them to do so. The human side of the first stages of a peace process may not seem totally relevant, but I believe they are vital. The person you're dealing with is often a person who has been involved and has hands that are blood-covered, a conscience that is heavily worn down, and charges to answer. And it is not always easy, if you're the peacemaker, to say that you're going to be comfortable talking to the men or women of violence. I know in my experience, those who assisted me and supported me would constantly come to me and say, we cannot wrest peacefully with so-and-so. We know what they've done. We know that their conscience should be speaking to them. How can we, as vehicles of peace, be at peace in their company? The lesson that I give you is this: until you're prepared to speak to those that you do not necessarily like, you're not beginning the process. I remember one occasion, 15 leaders, they called themselves brigadiers of the loyalist violence squads, were sitting round a table with me. And I deliberately began by saying, I don't want to know your names, and I don't want to know your identities, and I don't want to know what you would confess in a court of law. I simply want to know, if we get agreement, can you deliver? I was told afterwards that of the 15 people around that table, only one had not been guilty of murder. I was told that only one had not been consciously involved in ordering the death of people. And if I had spent time, ladies and gentlemen, worrying about the fact that I, a so-called instrument of peace, was talking to murderers, I wouldn't have got anywhere. I'd have walked out of the room. So the first lesson that I would suggest to you all, no matter what your interest in the Syrian situation is, be prepared to talk to those who are not necessarily attractive to you, because they are usually the people who can deliver, whether you like it or not. The second lesson I have learned is that unless you build up this very, very fragile thing called trust, you will get nowhere. It's easy to trust those you like and love. It's easy to build up trust with those who think the same as you do. But put yourself into a situation where they are the very opposite of what you have grown up to respect, and say, you have got to get them to trust you and you trust them. That, ladies and gentlemen, is monumental. I have only one solution as to how that can be achieved, and that is to say to myself, what is the consequence of failure? What if I don't trust? What do I have to face if I fail? And that is enough to push you forwards. The third thing is to recognize one very big human factor which transcends the personal into the constitutional. Psychiatrists, and I know there are some present, will tell you that one of the most powerful ingredients in the human mind is the power of memory. What we remember, how we remember, and how we equate its importance in life often dictates the person we are or the person we can become. In a situation of peacemaking, you must recognize the power of memory, because it takes us into the most contentious area, in my opinion, which is constantly dogging my efforts at keeping the peace, and that is, how do you deal with the past? Violence is so-called stopped. Peace process is beginning. How do you deal with what's already happened, and you cannot rewrite the past? In the room that I've described to you, there were among those 15 men who would one day have to answer before their Creator with their conscience. But short of that, the vast field we call victims were demanding already answers. and they fell into three categories. One, I will not get peace of mind until there is someone standing in a court of law charged with the murder of so-and-so, the crime of such and such, or whatever it is they're guilty of. I won't rest until that person is standing in what we call in English and Irish terms, the dock in a court. Then when I see that person being condemned, I will say, I'm at rest. That's the first category. The second category is a very sad one. And it says this: I'm not going to waste time in seeing somebody put into a dock and charged with murder and everything else. I just want to know what happened. What happened to my loved one? What happened to them on the day of that terrible crime? If someone could tell me what happened, I'd rest. And if I may be very personal, I will never, never, to the day of my own death, forget the incident where the mother of a girl who had been brutally murdered after an interrogation and torture by paramilitaries said to me, Lord Eames, I'm only asking for one thing. I want to know in those last few hours what happened to her. Did they give her her breakfast before they killed her? I know it's a very simple human reaction, but doesn't it say a lot? There are those victims who want to know what happened. That's the second category. The third category is those who somehow have come to terms that they can't rewrite the past, they can't change the past, and they want to move on. They want to somehow find a new life for their country, their community, themselves, and they want to move on to something called peace. Now, in those three categories, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest to you fall most of the people who you deal with in a peace process. The next thing I want to suggest to you is there are two levels of peace process, if not more. Two's enough for this morning. First of all, there is the peace that comes when the violence ceases. When we were negotiating between the two groups, Republicans and Loyalists, to bring an end to the actual killing machine, it was obvious to me and to my colleagues that the first signs that we were onto a winner was that they were weary. They had grown weary. And ladies, I have to tell you that your sex played a very important role, because it was the mothers and the wives who often said to the men of violence, stop it, we've had enough. So weariness is a first indication that something is about to happen. The second one, and perhaps of even greater importance, is this: when do you reach the point that you can convince people there is more for them in peace than in war? Can you convince them they will achieve more from their perspective and their aim by stopping the violence and turning to political life, politics, economics, dialogue, discussion, and peacemaking? And the indication that I always remember about that in my case was when people began to say, let's see what the political process can produce. At the height of our violence, those who were committed to prison for violence were in what was called H block. You may be familiar with that phrase from the past. It's simply because the prison looked like an H if you look down on it. It's called H. In one wing were the Republican prisoners, joined to the Loyalist prisoners by a short corridor not much longer than this room. They were separated. They led separate lives, but they were under the same roof. And one of the things that to lead me to trust was to visit both blocks at the height of the violence, to be vulnerable to them, because the prison officers stopped at the gate, and once you went through that gate, you were on your own and at the mercy of whoever was in charge. And so I had to build up the trust with them, both Republican and with Loyalists. And I have to tell you, he is dead and gone now, but I say this with respect to his memory. My opposite number, the Roman Catholic Archbishop, was a willing conspirator with me in this process. He would visit the Republicans, I'd visit the Loyalists, and then we'd switch. And I would visit those he had seen, and he'd visit those who I had seen. And over the years, they began to tell those still outside the prison and involved in the violence that they were beginning to trust us. They were beginning to listen. They were beginning to feel we were not their enemy. And so I say to you again, the peacemaker has to be the person of trust. The other aspect of this, which I have to emphasize, is that you cannot achieve reconciliation by legislation alone. Passing laws is important to build the framework. It does not deliver reconciliation if people's hearts and minds is not open to it. And so the peace process that I have been involved in is on two levels. The political, getting agreement to disagree in political terms, but to cooperate on many fronts. And on the other level, what is happening to ordinary people doing ordinary things in ordinary lives. And it's when you win the battle for hearts and minds that the first level begins to make some sense. It is not easy, and there have been many setbacks, but it is worth keeping going. And the last thing, Chairman, I won't overstay my welcome. The last thing I want to share to you about the mechanics of this is simply this. In the course of building a peace process, you learn a new definition of community. Because community does not mean we all agree on everything. When peace comes to Syria, don't expect, and we must say that it will come. Don't expect every Syrian to believe and accept the same thing. Glory in diversity. Glory in difference. Glory in different aspects that make the human frame and the human mind, but find a place where their common denominators can be respected. Because that is the key to a peace process. I'd finally like to be able to say to you, we're wonderful, we have got complete peace, and we're the example to the world, and I've been telling you lies. We have numerous problems, but we're still working at it, and we still believe we have some lessons to share with you and the world.